Do you spend hours in your head thinking about something that happened, could have happened, or might happen? Do you ask others what to do so you don't make a mistake? Welcome to the Playing It Safe podcast. I am Dr. Z, your host. I am a clinical psychologist, an author, and a person that is super passionate about sharing with you science-based skills to overcome any type of fear-based struggles. Who doesn't experience fear? Who doesn't play it safe? In this show, we will discuss how fear-based reactions happen in day-to-day life, how playing it safe behaviors look like, sound like, and feel like, how you can put into action solid tips from behavioral science to get unstuck from worries, fears, obsessions, and anxieties, and how you can start doing what works, what matters, and what you care about. Behavioral science doesn't have to be boring. Thanks for listening, and let's get started. Hello, everybody. This is Dr. Z, and I am so excited to bring the Plain It Safe podcast and newsletter back to you. You know what that means? It means that I am almost done writing the acceptance and commitment therapy workbook for the anxious procrastinator. Starting this month, I will be sending you 2 emails per month, including a recent podcast episode, an article, or other resources that have actionable skills for you to get better at dealing with anxiety, for you to stop reactively playing it safe, and for you to live your life to your best. Make sure to go to the website www.thisisdrz.com and subscribe to the newsletter there. In the next couple of months, I am going to be working on different online courses, all focused on acceptance and commitment therapy for anxiety-based struggles, and I'm hoping to do something different with the podcast. So make sure to stay in touch, and the best way to stay in touch is in the newsletter. For today's episode, I am sharing with you part two of my conversation with Dr. Monica Basco. She is a psychologist, an associate director for science policy, planning, and analysis at the Office of Research on Women's Health at the National Institute of Health. She has served as an assistant director for neuroscience, mental health, and broadening participation at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. From 2014 to 2015, Dr. Basco has been recognized as an international expert in cognitive behavior therapy and as a founding fellow of the Academy of Cognitive and Behavioral Therapies. She has also received the University of Texas Regents Outstanding Teaching Award. In episode 89, exploring the intersection of perfectionism, procrastination, and performance, Monica and I chat about perfectionism, high achieving behaviors, setting goals, the impact of setting goals, the role of confidence in goal setting, and the intersection of perfectionism and procrastination. In the second part of our conversation, Monica kindly shared her transition from academia to the White House as an introduction to the focus of this episode, which is the intersection of the imposter phenomenon and perfectionism. Perfectionists set exceptionally high standards for themselves, displaying a relentless drive to achieve what they perceive as flawless outcomes. However, when these standards are not met, it can lead to overwhelming feelings of failure. Even when they succeed, perfectionists may fear that others will see through their facade. A highlight of my conversation with Monica is discussing the importance of discriminating and differentiating when perfectionistic actions are an asset and when they become a liability. You will hear us talking about what the imposter phenomenon is, the relationship between perfectionism and self expectations, how you can overcome the imposter syndrome, how perfectionistic behaviors can show up in different contexts in your life, how to balance perfectionistic behaviors and the fear of failure, and how to distinguish when to turn on and off your perfectionistic actions. I hope you find this episode helpful. And as usual, if you have any comments or any questions or curiosities, make sure to send me an email. The website again is www.thisisdrz.com. I wish you a fabulous day, and let's jump onto the episode with Dr. Monica Basco. How do you see the intersection of perfectionism and the imposter phenomenon?
Yeah, when I was, I spent several years working at the National Institutes of Health, and I was working on diversity and inclusion in grant funding. Who gets grant money? Who doesn't get grant money? How can we help scientists who are less likely to get funded, which turned out to be people who were not white male, older, established scientists. Everybody else, how do we help them get research dollars? And that led to lots of questions about what holds us back from success. And we had, for a while, the topic of imposter phenomenon as being part of the problem was very popular. And it continues to be a popular concept. It was established a long time ago, but it came back into popularity. And the imposter phenomenon pieces, I think, is that, the notion behind it is that perhaps that the kinds of negative expectations might have about you are true. And so perhaps I am not really smart enough, good enough, experienced enough, self-aware enough, and perhaps I will fail. And if I do well, if I happen to be successful, it might be not because of my personal attributes, but just by chance.
Luck.
And in fact, by luck. And in fact, if I do well, I actually feel like a fake when I'm trying to do well. I feel like I'm pretending to be successful when I know in my heart of hearts I'm really not successful. So I feel like an imposter. That's where the term came from. I feel like I'm a failure, or I'm a fake underneath all of it, and I'm just pretending to be a successful person. That's what I see as part of where that overlaps with perfectionism, is that the expectation for a perfectionist, a self-expectation, is much higher than the expectations for the average person. So the person who's either not a perfectionist or only is mildly perfectionistic. And if your expectation is extremely high, like if your expectation is you'll do things perfectly and you fail, you say, that's me, I'm not a success. If you do well, you say, I succeeded this time, but people probably realize I'm really not as smart as I'm acting. And they're going to be critical of me. But if your expectation for yourself is not at the highest level, and it is in fact somewhere in the moderate range, then your perception of success and failure both seem pretty reasonable. I could do well, or I could fail, depending on what it is. And just because I'm not the best doesn't mean I'm not good at what I do. So I think in terms of how they overlap, it also overlaps with what do you do about it, which has to do with establishing your own expectations consciously. So the person who believes that they're imposter actually has very high goals for themselves and high standards for themselves, and they work very hard and they achieve it. Where they fail is in this notion that by virtue of who they are, or by virtue of their demographics, I probably am not that successful. I'm not that smart, not as smart as these other people who don't look like me. So these other folks, really, they're the ones who are really successful. And I have to either overcompensate by working extraordinarily hard, or I'm going to hide my accomplishments. I'm not going to raise my hand and say, I did that great thing, because I run the risk of somebody calling me on my imposter status. I run the risk of people saying, well, you came up with that idea, but it really wasn't very good. Yeah. And you really aren't as smart as you think. I actually had that experience as a young faculty member. I'll tell you that story, but if we get a chance, but it's really quite interesting. You want me to tell you the story?
Yes, I would love to.
So I started my professional career as a research assistant professor at a medical school. And I was studying marital interaction among people who had depression.
Mhm.
and looking at the dynamic. I was trained in graduate school on interpersonal communication, and so I was looking at how that fits in what's going on in marriages or relationships of people who suffer from depression, and looking at that, and did a number of studies with some friends, and we did really good, and we published a paper, and we in an American Psychological Association journal, and it was time for me to. I was invited to give grand rounds at my own institution.
Wow.
Very big honor. Department of Psychiatry. It was in medical schools. I was faculty in the Department of Psychiatry. There are mostly psychiatrists, but there were a handful of psychologists as well. And I gave this talk, and I was very pleased with myself. And one of the high-ranking administrators in my department stood up during questions and answers, came up to the stage, standing next to me, and told me that everything I have found in my research really supports a psychoanalytic approach to looking at relationships, and basically saying I was promoting this sort of cognitive behavioral formulation, and so good thing I'm quick on my feet. So what I said to him was, "You're welcome. I'm glad that we could help support your work as well." I said, actually, what I said, I think something like, "Me and my behavioral colleagues say you're welcome." So it didn't affect me. It didn't knock me off my feet. I don't have imposter phenomenon. I probably have an inflated level of self-esteem given by parents who had total confidence in me. So I think I inherited that, honestly. But someone else, I was imagining the people I was treating who were depressed as part of my clinical trial work, and being in that same situation and being devastated, absolutely devastated. And the person who spoke up, I think he felt very good about himself, and he walked away, and we didn't have any further discussion about that particular topic. But it was one of those things where, depending on your sensitivity, depending on what you expect of yourself in terms of that perfectionism, you could walk away with the thought that this guy was just really inappropriate in a professional scenario, which is what I thought to myself while I was trying to formulate my comeback line. Or you could, if I had imposter phenomenon, I could really take it very personally. And at that early stage of my career, it could have really knocked me off my feet in terms of my confidence in what I was doing. So that's, I think, again, where I came upon focusing on perfectionism in my work and writing about it in my book, Never Good Enough, was I kept encountering people who were depressed and very much had these perfectionistic tendencies and what could be called imposter phenomenon. And I didn't understand it. So I didn't grow up having a lack of confidence. So I didn't understand how you could be award-winning in your field
Mhm.
and still feel like I'm really not that good and they're going to figure it out
Mhm. Yeah.
soon, and I'm going to be humiliated. And that's the imposter phenomenon component. And so I started to investigate that and figure out how to fix that, because it turned out to be a very common feature in those kinds of perfectionists who were very hard on themselves. It wasn't an issue for the people who are perfectionistic, but more towards others. They feel okay about themselves, but they have their standards are too high for others. But for those who were more self-focused, it was very damaging, and an experience like the one I had really could have caused significant problems in the person who had that issue.
Yeah, such a great story. I think to be human is to second guess ourselves, is to doubt ourselves, to doubt
Absolutely.
competence, right? Just part of
Absolutely.
human experience. The challenge is that when we hold onto those second guessing thoughts as the absolute truth of who we are, and then with feedback like that,
Yeah.
yes,
It's not adaptive.
it's not, it could be very debilitating.
Yes.
And I think one of the things that happens when some people are engaging in perfectionistic action towards themselves is that their sense of self again becomes defined by these accomplishment successes. And
It
any
can very
question
well.
like that, right,
Yes.
can be tricky, right? Uh,
Absolutely.
Now, I have a
Mhm.
really good question for you, and this is more a curiosity. Um,
Okay.
so I have read your books. You're a prolific author, a prolific psychologist with an incredible academic background. And then at some point, you were the former assistant director at the Obama White House in the Office of Science and Technology. And it blew my mind. It blew my mind to see that. I
Blew my
think
mind to be there.
such a neat thing. And I'm wondering, how was for you that process of transition from perhaps an academic setting into working in the White House?
So there were several steps. So I went from many years of academia to government first, and I took a job at the National Institutes of Health. And this was after doing research and doing a lot of teaching, both graduate and undergraduate, and a lot of clinical work, both through research and also it was a private practice, as most of us multitask and had been doing lots of things. And I was ready for a change. And the change came as my youngest son went off to college, and my husband and I had an empty nest for the first time in forever. It seemed like forever. And so we were ready. Both of us were ready for a change. And so did some work consulting with the National Institute of Health on a project, and the people I worked with loved working for the federal government. They were all PhDs or MDs who had done research. Most of them had done research, and they loved what they got out of that work by being in a different position in government. So I took a job with them, went to work at the National Institutes of Health. It very quickly blossomed into something other than what I was hired to do, because at the time that I took the job, the entity I worked for within the NIH there had been an article published about some work that had been done. It showed that people from minority groups, primarily Black scientists, were getting less research dollars than everybody else. And they weren't sure why. And they asked a lot of people to try to figure out why. And so I became responsible for a small part of that story. So that gave me it turned my area of work from being personally affected by being a Mexican American in a white environment to what was happening to the other scientists and looking into it. Fortuitously, honestly, a lot of this has to do with chance. I was finished wrapping up a project at the NIH, the one I'm talking about, and there was a vacancy at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. And what I learned about DC in those days is who you know actually really does matter, because you don't learn about openings unless you talk to people who know things about things. And in this case, it was my youngest son, who had done an internship in a related office that worked closely with the same office, knew people, and introduced me to people. And I called the people he networked me to. And I said, hey, I'm interested in what you all are doing. This is a project I've been working on for the last several years. It's wrapping up. I'm ready for the next big thing. And they happened to have a psychologist in the office who was retiring. And somebody who had been there from the National Science Foundation was retiring, and they needed somebody who understood 3 areas that were being vacated with the changes that were happening. One was somebody who could understand mental health.
Mm-hmm.
That was me. Someone who understood the diversity and inclusion, equity issues around the STEM fields. That was me. That's what I had been doing at the White House. At the NIH. And the third thing, it was someone who had a general understanding of neuroscience and neuroscience research. And I had that in my background. So I checked the boxes and I was brought over. Now, the way things work in the government is I actually kept my job at the National Institute, and they sent me out on detail. So I continued to be an NIH employee. I just was detailed to the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. And I was assigned all kinds of things, from suicide prevention in veterans to the brain initiative, the NIH brain initiative, that's funded a tremendous amount of research in how to understand the brain. And I was also tasked with trying to figure out the issues around why are there fewer people from underrepresented groups in the STEM fields. And so I took those on and did projects, and I worked for a year in the office, and then continued after I had to go back to the NIH, but took that work with me and then continued to explore it and expand it. And since I retired from the government, I've continued to do that work. In fact, I'm currently chairing a AAAS working group on empowering career pathways and looking into where the career trajectories and educational trajectories are, and how do you get that information out to people who might be interested in STEM fields, including children, students, their parents, and how do you address the obstacles that academia and other professions put in front of you when you're trying to achieve your educational goals, and what can we do to get rid of what we are calling exclusionary practices that might actually interfere with success as opposed to enhance it. So I've continued to do it. It opened a door. So that's a long answer for a short question. But some of this was chance. Some of this was I found a place that just happened to be interested in what I was also interested in, and surrounded by a group of incredibly brilliant people, 120 scientists and engineers in the Office of Science and Technology Policy at that time, all of them very collaborative, all of them from different agencies around the government, and brought those resources to bear on the work that they did. And it was amazing. Probably the best, certainly the best job I've ever had.
It sounds like a very neat time in your career. That sounds amazing. And here you are, you're still working on it. That's amazing.
And that was during the Obama administration, just as a caveat. Those were those years. Yes.
Here's a silly question. Given that you went from working in academia with a prestigious career into the White House in a science department, will you say that your perfectionistic behaviors were helpful for you in that new setting, working for the government?
So I think the perfectionism was not helpful in the government as much as it was helpful in all the things that led to that transition in life. So I think as probably in looking at the news every day, perfectionism doesn't really exist in government. I mean, it's because what's perfect for one person is a failure for somebody else, or less than perfect, right? So it didn't help me in that regard. And in fact, if I had been a perfectionist, I probably would not have accomplished very much, because I would have been too stuck on trying to get it right, and there was just no way to get it right. There were too many voices. So I think that helped. I do think that the part of me that can be perfect. So I think my perfectionism has pockets, and it's really in the science realm. So I think in the world, my work as a researcher, and all that I did specifically, that's where it really paid off, because you have to do everything perfectly in order to get the answer to your research question, and you have to manage your data and your people, and there's all these kinds of things that result in a product that's meaningful, a scientific result that's meaningful. So I would say that's where it really paid off.
That's neat to hear. In which settings these behaviors can be helpful, workable, and effective, and when they are not.
Yep.
If it's okay, we're running out of time, and I have two more questions.
Okay.
So when I think about perfectionists, I am thinking about 4 variables. I am thinking about a strong fear of being a failure, a strong fear of making mistakes, what we call inact rule govern behaviors, or rules about how things supposed to be, how people are supposed to be, and a sense of self attached to successes, accomplishments, and failures. I think all this is driven by the fear of failure. I think the fear of failure can lead to what we call perfectionism, topographically speaking, to lead to procrastination and the imposter phenomenon. Any thoughts about that?
A fear is a very strong motivator, and the fear of failure is something that is extremely common, and it varies in how bad it is. So there's the low level of fear of failure that makes you just try harder and study before the exam kind of fear. And then there's the fear of my husband's a surgeon. If you don't do things perfectly, somebody can die. That's adaptive fear of failure. Like, you want that person, you want your surgeons to all be perfectionists. So it has a place. As I've been saying, there's pros and cons to everything. It definitely has a place. So I think the strategy is to figure out where you need it and where you don't need it, where you can turn the volume down on your fear and where you can embrace it. So if I'm checking spreadsheets of data in my years as a researcher, I want my perfectionistic lens to be full force. I want to be afraid of making a mistake, and I want my students to be afraid of making mistakes, that I want them to do their part perfectly. That's where it's really adaptive. You want to keep it, you want to use it. And so I think reflecting on the importance of the task of getting things, there are times when, in fact, getting things done, doing things perfectly really does matter, and it defines the outcome, and it has implications. So there's places where you really need a high level of focus on trying to do things exactly right. And if you can learn to distinguish those situations from the other ones, the ones that have fewer consequences attached to them, or the consequences are mild or not important to you. You have to be able to separate them apart so that you don't approach the universe with everything has to be perfect. You make your kids crazy, by the way, if you try to do things exactly right. I remember my son who's now in his late 30s, but I remember him being like in fifth grade or fourth grade and doing his homework, and it was the writing on his sheet was like really sloppy, and I looked at it and I said, don't you want to like fix that and be a little neater in how you're writing that? And he said, Mom, I just need to get the right answer. I don't need to do it perfectly. And I thought, success. That was my, like, as a mother, I obviously succeeded. I didn't catch myself before I said it, but clearly that got the message across. He was able to, at that very young age, to differentiate, and he still does. He does some things very perfectly,
Mhm.
and other things he allows flexibility in, as would, but he adjusted my expectations. What's important and what's not important.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. Some people, when they are thinking about perfectionism or procrastination, they think that it's not just the fear of failure that drive these clusters of behaviors, that it could be the fear of not being good enough. How do you
Oh,
see
sure. Yeah. So that's actually the title of my
it? Yeah.
perfectionism book is Never Good Enough. And so the premise, I think, in the book, and what I tend to pursue in clinically as well, is you want to take advantage of the places, of the situations where your perfectionism really helps you to be better, where it
Mhm.
really helps you to do things well. And you want to distinguish that from the places in your life where it really doesn't help you. And the place that doesn't help you is feeling like a failure for not being perfect. That doesn't really make you more effective in what you do by thinking about yourself that way. And so you have to consciously tease apart when you need to turn the perfectionism on and off
Mhm.
in order to have better quality of life, and make a habit of it. And you'll know that you're running into an obstacle with this when you're feeling that stress, that pressure, that fear that drives it. It's active. Your perfectionism is active if you're feeling that tremendous anxiety and fear about failure. And you have to take a step back and say, okay, really, how important is it that this particular thing be done perfectly?
That's
And
right.
there's time when you have to, when it's absolutely critical that you do it
Mhm.
perfectly.
That's right. When your husband is performing a surgery or the mechanic is fixing my car. Mhm.
Yes, I want to. Yes, the guy. That's
Perfection.
absolutely true.
Yeah.
I'd pay them more to be perfect. That's the kind of thing you really want that. And you have to be able to distinguish that from the times when it's really probably not that big of a deal. Like my fifth grade sons who said, I don't need this to be perfect. I just need it to be correct. He cared about grades, and he's very smart. So he cared about grades even at that point in time, but he didn't need to care about how neat his work was.
Mhm, mhm. Monica, do you think people that has different types of fears, let's say fears of rejection, fears of humiliation, fears of not being good enough, cope with that fear differently? I am thinking of Jeffrey Young and schema therapy, looking at how the avoidance and the surrender and the overcompensating patterns look different based on the type of fear a person is struggling with. Any
I think that's true. I think depending on your fear, yes, you certainly make different decisions and you perceive yourself differently. But I also think within a given individual, there's going to be some situations where that fear is adaptive and functioning and useful, and there's places where it's not. So I think it's even in somebody who may have a fear of failure, again, like I'm saying, sometimes that's okay because it'll make you work harder at what you're doing. And sometimes it's not okay if all it does is make you go in circles and hate yourself. It's not useful in a particular situation. So I encourage your listeners to not put perfectionism into two boxes. Either you are or you're not. It's really not like that. It's really you have more of it or less of it, and more of it or less of it in certain kinds of situations. And sometimes that's a good thing to have more of it when it's needed. And sometimes it's not a good thing. You have too much of it and it just makes you miserable. And the task you're trying to do is not all that important. It's not important to have it be perfect.
Mhm.
So I think of all of these things. I think there's a lot of what we do that makes us really good at the kinds of things, or gives us great satisfaction to see something done perfectly. My mother used to decorate cakes. She
Oh,
loved it. She loved it when her cakes,
a piece of art.
these little roses and things that say and I could care less about. I never picked up the scale. I could care less. I'd rather go to the grocery store and buy the cake. So, but it gave her such pleasure to do it perfectly and to see it.
It's
Um, as an example, was adaptive, and she wasn't a perfectionist really in much of anything else except that, those kind of small things that really mattered to her. And so that's really kind of what people have to walk away with, is that it's okay to be a perfectionist. Just figure out how much of it, when you need it, and try to lower the volume on it. Like, you don't have to get rid of it. Just kind of figure out where you need it, and see if you can catch yourself in times when you don't really need it, and do something about it.
Yeah, it's about finding the golden nuggets of perfectionistic actions, right?
I like that.
Finding the treasures of them.
Sometimes you need a nugget. Yes.
We do. Here's my last question. If you were to have a cup of coffee or tea or a beer or a scotch, anyone you want today, who will that be and why?
Wow, that is a huge question. I think I'd like to sit with Michelle Obama and hear her reflections on what it was like during the years when they were all at the White House, but all of the work that she's done since then in leading, and where she thinks it's important for people to put their energy in being like successful and doing more for their communities. And I'd like to know what, based on all her experience and knowledge and insights, like where she is. I think that would be a person who could give guidance to lots of us in the work that we still do.
Yeah, I think that will be a very juicy.
I think it would be wine for me. Yeah, I definitely would go for the wine, not the scotch.
Will you love it. And on that note, I want to say thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thanks for listening. If you like this episode, I will very much appreciate it if you will subscribe and share this podcast with your friends. And if you're feeling extra generous, I welcome a review on Apple Podcasts. Show notes of this episode are in the website playingitsafe.zone. Make sure to subscribe to my newsletter so you can receive more tips to stop all types of unworkable playing it safe actions. See you soon!